I remember the sound of the crystal glass more than the words at first, a sharp clink echoing against the polished oak table, the chandelier light bouncing off the rim. And then came the sentence that knocked the air from my lungs. "You're nothing without Grandpa's money. Half of that $2 million estate should have been mine." The words belonged to Casey, my cousin, though she might as well have been a stranger that night. She leaned back in her chair, smiling her lipstick, marking the edge of the glass. On the table between us lay a black folder, its flap, worn from too many hands pulling it open and shut. Inside were photocopies of the will, the last words of a man who had worked his entire life to build a home and savings worth more than most families could dream of. I tightened my grip on the folder as though it were a shield. The room filled with laughter, polite to some, nervous to others. I felt my skin prickle under the weight of their glances. They weren't really looking at me. They were looking at the estate, at the house by the river, at the investments my grandfather had left behind. My chair suddenly felt small, too light to carry the heaviness pressing down on me. I told myself to breathe. One breath in, one breath out. I tried to focus on the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging like a heartbeat no one could disturb. But even then, I could hear the echo of Casey's words digging deeper into my chest. "You're nothing." I had heard versions of it before, tossed at me in school hallways, whispered at family dinners, disguised as jokes. Yet hearing it now tied to the inheritance I never asked for but had been entrusted with made it sting in a way I hadn't known was possible. The rest of the table carried on, forks tapping plates, wine being poured again. It was as if nothing had been said. Smiles stayed, plastered conversations about vacations and stock portfolios floated around. I could almost believe the insult had dissolved into the air. But it hadn't. It lingered like smoke, suffocating and invisible, only I could smell it. I glanced at the silver keys lying near my plate, the house keys. My grandfather's estate had come with more than a balance sheet. It came with walls filled with his books, his tools, his memories. Those keys had weight, even as they rested on the linen napkin ignored by everyone else. Nobody asked about them. Nobody congratulated me for the responsibility. They were just waiting for me to misplace them so someone else could pick them up. A chorus of happy birthday began, awkward and off-key, masking the silence I carried inside. I smiled, or at least I thought I did. It felt more like stretching a mask across my face. My laughter joined theirs, hollow as an empty glass. But in the hollow, anger grew. I looked around the room and realized the truth: nobody had defended me. Not my uncle with his hand always out, not my aunt who loved to gossip about everyone but herself, not even the siblings who once borrowed my textbooks and called me generous. They had all stayed quiet, complicit in Casey's cruelty. That night I saw myself through their eyes. A wallet with a face, a set of keys to a future they believed they deserved more than me. I told myself to keep calm. There would be time to speak, time to act. But not yet, not in the middle of cake and candles and shallow toasts. For now, silence was the only armor I had. Still, deep down, I knew silence would not last forever. This insult mattered. The folder, the keys, the inheritance, it all mattered. And Casey, with her smirk and her careless words, had no idea what storm she had invited to the table. So I smiled through the rest of the song, clapped politely when the cake was cut, and kept my secret close. I will explain in a moment. But first, let me ask you this. Tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe. We need to talk about families and money. I was 29 when the estate became mine. Not all of it, of course. Lawyers, taxes, and paperwork took their share. Still, the numbers were undeniable, a $2 million estate broken down into real property, investments, and savings. It was more than I had ever imagined holding responsibility for. I had been careful even before all this. Years of working in mid-level finance, watching people squander their salaries, had taught me discipline. I lived in a modest apartment in the city, a one-bedroom with creaky floors, but a view of the park. My friends liked to tease me about my grandparent habits: packed lunches, secondhand furniture savings, tucked neatly into a retirement account. But those habits had kept me afloat. When my grandfather passed, they became the foundation I stood on, while the rest of the family circled like hawks. Casey was the loudest hawk. Casey and I had grown up side by side, birthdays celebrated together, summers spent in the same backyard. Back then, I thought we were friends as much as cousins. She had a laugh that carried across swimming pools and a confidence that filled every room. But somewhere along the way, her confidence hardened into entitlement. She never kept a steady job. She was always between opportunities. Her apartment was an endless carousel of luxury handbags and brand new shoes, though rent payments somehow always slipped her mind. Instagram became her diary, filled with pictures of rooftop bars and designer cocktails, all tagged with captions like manifesting abundance. The truth, though, her abundance came from other people's pockets. I knew it before the inheritance. I had been her safety net too many times. When she called crying about being behind on rent, I wired her $1,500. When her car broke down, I covered the repairs. Each time she promised to pay me back, and each time the promise faded like morning mist. I told myself family was family. You helped because one day maybe they would help you too. But deep down, I think I knew. The breaking point wasn't the birthday insult. That came later. The real crack began one afternoon at work when a colleague leaned over my desk with a raised eyebrow. "Did you see Casey's story?" she asked, showing me her phone. There it was, Casey posing with a brand new designer bag, champagne glass in hand. The caption, "Crisis averted, time to treat myself." The date of the post was the same day I had wired her money for overdue utilities. I felt the air thicken. I stared at the photo until the letters blurred. It wasn't the bag or the champagne, it was the casual cruelty of it, the way she flaunted the lie. But that wasn't the only discovery. A week later, another message appeared, not on Instagram, but in an email thread she had forgotten to delete before forwarding me a file. I don't know why she sent it by mistake, but I think whatever careless instinct guided her hand. The email was to her boyfriend. I read it 3 times before I could believe the words. "Easy money. I just have to cry a little and Morgan always pays. Honestly, it's like having my own personal ATM with feelings." I felt the words burn into me. I closed the laptop, opened it again, hoping they would disappear. They didn't. They never do. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the keys to the estate in front of me. The brass felt cold. I thought about my grandfather, how he used to polish his shoes until they gleamed, how he would tuck spare bills into an envelope labeled for emergencies. He had lived through decades of saving, scraping, doing without. And now the money he left behind had become a weapon in the hands of someone who saw me as less than human. I told myself to stay calm. People lash out when they're desperate. Maybe Casey was just venting, exaggerating to impress her boyfriend. But the thought lingered. Maybe she meant every word. The following weekend, the family gathered again. It was meant to be casual, a dinner at my aunt's house, laughter around the table. But I noticed the small things, the way Casey arrived late but insisted on sitting at the head of the table, the way she boasted about networking opportunities while scrolling on her phone, the way no one questioned her stories. When she leaned in close, whispering about a small loan she needed to hold her over until the next big thing, I smiled politely and excused myself to the kitchen. Inside, I poured myself water and stared at the tiled floor. Something inside me hardened. I had all the proof I needed, the Instagram post, the email, the receipts from my bank, proof that I wasn't just being used, I was being mocked. I returned to the table with a steady smile. I laughed at the jokes. I asked about vacations. I played my part, but under the surface, I was no longer the cousin who quietly wired money in the dark. I was the keeper of a folder. I had already begun printing screenshots, compiling statements, a record of betrayal bound in paper. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. I thought about silence, about patience. My grandfather used to say that storms don't need to shout, they arrive and you know. Casey thought she was untouchable. She thought a few tears could unlock my bank account forever. She thought I was nothing without the money. But she was wrong. The storm was already gathering, and I would not warn her before it broke. The thing about betrayal is that it never really arrives in silence. It arrives in whispers that grow louder in glances, that sting in moments that turn ordinary days into unforgettable wounds. For me, the betrayal became undeniable at another family gathering, a birthday dinner, this time though not mine. It was for one of the younger cousins, a simple evening with balloons tied to the fence and music humming from a wireless speaker. There were folding chairs on the lawn, paper plates sagging under barbecue ribs, the kind of easy summer gathering where laughter should be louder than arguments. But that night, laughter turned sharp. Casey arrived late, of course, stepping out of a rideshare with her phone raised high, recording herself for Instagram. She filmed the house, the lights, even the driveway, narrating like she was the host of a show. Another family celebration, she announced to her followers. Let's see how long before drama starts. She winked at the screen. I watched from the porch, drink in hand, silent. She breezed past me without a hello her perfume, leaving a trail of something floral and expensive. It was the same perfume she had bragged about in her posts last week, bought with the same rent money I had sent her. Dinner began. The kids ran in and out, cousins told old stories, and for a brief moment I thought maybe, just maybe, the night would pass without the familiar sting. But family has a way of circling back to the very wounds you hope to keep hidden. Halfway through the meal, Casey cleared her throat. So she said loud enough for the table to hush, "How's life as a trust fund, baby Morgan?" The words fell heavy. A few chuckles escaped from the end of the table, but most faces turned toward their plates. My aunt coughed, my uncle sipped his beer, and the silence that followed was worse than the question itself. I forced a smile. "I work, Casey. Always have." She smirked. "Sure, sure. But we all know the real story. You've got Grandpa's money to fall back on. Must be nice, huh? No rent worries, no bills piling up. Some of us live in the real world." The table shifted uncomfortably. I felt every eye on me, not out of sympathy, but curiosity. They wanted to see how I would react. Would I defend myself? Would I snap? I chose neither. I set down my fork and folded my napkin as if the conversation bored me. But inside I felt a heat rise slow and steady, not the flare of anger, but the burn of humiliation. And then she twisted the knife. "You know," she continued, leaning back in her chair, "if family meant anything, you'd be helping out more. Spread the wealth, Morgan. What's a few thousand here and there when you've got millions in your pocket?" The word millions hung in the air like smoke. She wasn't guessing. She had done the math, maybe even snooped through records, or perhaps someone had whispered the numbers after too many glasses of wine. I glanced at the folder I had brought with me tucked inside my bag by the door. I had not planned to use it yet, not tonight, not at a child's birthday, but the thought lingered. I could end this charade right now. Instead, I stayed quiet. The party carried on. Cake was served, children blew out candles, and Casey clapped the loudest, her smile wide, as though nothing had happened. But I saw the way she watched me, waiting for a reaction. She fed on it my silence. Later that night, as the dishes were being cleared, I overheard her in the kitchen. Her phone was on speaker, her voice dripping with laughter. "Of course Morgan will cave," she told someone, her boyfriend maybe. "It's just a matter of time. Honestly, I don't even feel bad. That inheritance is wasted on someone so boring. I'll make better use of it. Trips, investments, maybe even a new car. Easy money always has been." I stood in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe. I wanted to storm in, to shout, to tear the phone from her hand and read the truth out loud. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I walked out into the night air. The stars above were sharp, countless points of light, and I remembered my grandfather teaching me the constellations when I was a child. He used to say that patience was like the star's steady constant, always there if you remembered to look up. So I waited. I began collecting more. Not just the email, not just the Instagram story. I started saving every bank transfer receipt, every text where she asked for help, every story where she bragged about manifesting abundance. Piece by piece, the folder grew heavier. I did not plan to humiliate her privately. That would have been too easy. Casey thrived on an audience, so it would take an audience to bring her down. The final straw came weeks later when she posted a picture from the balcony of a luxury hotel downtown. The caption read, "Manifestation works, sweet life forever." I recognized the date. It was the same week she had begged me for money, claiming her landlord was about to evict her. That was the moment I stopped seeing her as family. She wasn't just careless, she was cruel. She looked at me and saw not a cousin, not a person, but a wallet with feelings. And so I made my choice. The next family gathering would not end in silence. You can tell when a party is trying too hard. The napkins are monogrammed, the candles smell like citrus and money. There is a string quartet in a corner, pretending not to notice when guests clap at the wrong moments. This was Casey's doing, not mine. She picked the restaurant, the private room, the dress code, even the playlist the quartet should imitate. All I did was arrive on time and set my black folder beside the water glass like any other place setting. I kept my voice low, my steps measured. The more I softened at the edges, the more she sharpened hers. She floated around the room with a camera smile, hugging people she had not called in months, telling the violinist she would tag them later. My aunt fussed over flowers. My uncle counted the bottles of wine as if they were merit badges. Somewhere a cousin practiced a toast on the Notes app, looking at the ceiling as though brilliance lived in ventilation. No one asked about my folder. They did not need to. They had already decided what lived in it, money, access, obligation. While they greeted me, their eyes kept sliding to the envelope and the keys that rode quietly in my jacket pocket. People are never subtle about the things they want. The server refilled glasses. The first toast rose and fell. I nodded when my name was mentioned, with the same tone you use for a helpful neighbor who lends out tools. There was talk of legacies and opportunity. There was talk of family pulling together. It sounded like a weather report for a town that never sees rain. Casey took the floor at last, tapping her glass with a fork. Her dress glittered like a dare. She raised her chin. She loved the height of attention. She thanked everyone for coming. She thanked herself for organizing. She thanked life for favoring the bold. Then she turned just a fraction so the room could watch us together. It was not an accident. She knew how to frame a shot. And to Morgan she said, bright as a showroom light, whose good fortune reminds us that blessings land where they are most needed. Laughter, not kind. What is family for, she added, if not to share? A question posed like a charge. Eyes moved from my face to my folder and back again. I could feel a tide trying to pull me out. It is strange how quickly affection becomes arithmetic when money is in the room. I stood slow enough to quiet the table. I am not tall, but silence can add inches. I smiled at the quartet as if I might request an old tune. Then I opened the folder and placed a neat stack of papers beside the cake knife. The printer ink looked severe under the chandelier. I brought something to share, I said. Since we are speaking of family. Casey beamed. She expected gratitude. She expected a check. She did not expect the first page a screenshot of her story from the night she said utilities were overdue, the night she held a champagne flute on a hotel balcony, and typed the words, "Sweet life forever." The date was circled. So was the transfer from my bank printed on the next page in black and white, the memo line reading, "Help until payday." The room did not gasp all at once. Shame is slower than that. It takes a few seconds to translate. Someone's fork slipped against porcelain. My aunt's hand went to her necklace and stayed there. The quartet went quiet on its own, then realized and resumed softer as if walking past a closed door. Casey made a sound like a laugh that forgot its manners. "This is tacky," she said, reaching for the stack. I placed my fingers lightly on the top sheet. Gentle can be stronger than force when you are certain. She pulled back her hand like a child told to wait. I slid the second set forward. An email chain stripped of its decor addressed to a boyfriend who called her Angel in lowercase. Easy money, she had written. I just have to cry a little. Morgan always pays. It is like having my own personal machine that spits cash, only this one says please and thank you. When people read their own words out loud in their heads, they do not recognize the voice. Casey tried a smile that landed crooked. "Jokes," she said. "Private jokes. You know how couples talk." She tilted her head, asking the room to agree. Far down the table, no one moved. I stacked the third set. Requests month after month. The reasons varied. The rhythm did not. A late fee here, a pledge to return there. Under each request, a screenshot of the purchase that followed within 48 hours. Shoes, bottles, seats at a concert, with a view of a stage shaped like a letter. The brand names gleamed in their own fonts, making their case better than I ever could. "You dug through my life," Casey said. "That is sick." She spoke as if trespass lived on paper instead of in habit. "You sent most of it to me," I answered. I pressed print. Someone coughed. Someone set a glass down too hard. My uncle looked at his hands and discovered they had grown old without permission. The quartet stopped again, and this time nobody minded. Outside, a siren passed on the street like a distant opinion. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Projection is not just about screens. "You called me a trust fund baby," I said. "You called me nothing without a dead man's money." I laid the photocopy of my grandfather's clause on the table, the one written in his stubborn hand and notarized with a stamp that looked like a small bruise on the page. Any descendant proven dishonest will lose claim to discretionary distributions. Those were his words, old-fashioned and clear. He kept commas like guard dogs. Casey leaned in. Her lipstick had bled a little at the corner. No one had told her. "This is defamation," she said louder, as if volume might introduce truth where there was none. "You cannot just show people private messages. I will sue." From the far end of the room, a chair scraped. Our family's lawyer, he had been invited for the free dessert, and the way his name impressed out-of-town cousins, stood tapping his napkin with 2 fingers. He did not smile. He rarely did when he meant something. No, Casey, he said, speaking as if he were reading courtroom instructions. Defamation requires falsehood. These are your words, your posts, your timestamps. And the clause is very real. You are not in danger of a lawsuit tonight. You are in danger of consequences. She blinked at him as if he had switched languages. You all love this, she said, sweeping an arm at the table. She is making a fool of me to feel superior. She pointed at me with the whole hand as though names might be dirty if she used one finger. You always wanted this power. I looked at the folder. Power, I said, is what you tried to take when you turned kindness into a lever. A server walked in with the cake at the worst possible moment, candles burning like a misunderstanding. He froze. The cake kept smoking. Someone whispered to blow them out before wax made maps on the icing. He retreated like a man, disappearing from a painting. But what they did not know was that my folder held one more thing. I pulled a slim envelope from the back and slid it toward the center. Inside was a printed schedule of transfers I had already set up with the estate manager. A trust quietly opening for my younger cousins who kept their grades up and their noses out of trouble. A grant for a community kitchen my grandfather used to visit on Thursdays. Funds for the library that still bore his initials in the donor wall from decades back when his money was smaller and his hope was not. This is where the discretionary amounts go, I said. Not to handbags or hotel balconies. To the things he loved. And to people who do not call family and open till. The room exhaled, but not in approval. It was the sound a house makes when a storm's first branch scrapes the siding. They were beginning to understand what this night would change. Most of them would go home and tell themselves they had not taken sides. They would be wrong. Casey's chair screeched as she stood. She reached for a wineglass and missed, then found another and threw it sideways into empty air that was suddenly full of shards. Red stained the tablecloth like a cheap lesson in symbolism. A few guests flinched. One of the quartet players lifted a violin by reflex as if protecting a child. This is not over, Casey said, chest heaving. Her voice cracked and then grew brave again. I will post the truth. You already did, I said, and closed the folder. For a heartbeat, the room went utterly still. You could hear the candles on the abandoned cake mutter to themselves. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and murmured something to my aunt about steps we would take in the morning. My uncle nodded without lifting his eyes. The cousins began looking at their phones, faces bending into that private light, the way flowers tilt toward windows. I put on my jacket. The keys settled into the pocket like a familiar hand. As I passed the quartet, the cellist looked up. Do you want a song? He asked very quietly. A kindness offered like a blanket you can refuse. Play anything my grandfather might have hummed, I said. He liked the songs that knew how to end. I did not look back at the table. You only need to see a fire start once to know it will burn. In the hallway, I felt lighter not because I had won anything, but because I had finally put down what was not mine to carry. Outside, the night air had that city smell of stone and rain and distant bakery. The car horns were small and human. I walked past the window and saw a dozen reflections trying to decide who the villain was. Let them. Truth is not a popularity contest. It is a ledger that eventually balances. The door clicked shut behind me, and with it the last of my patience. Some storms you ride out, some you call into being. I used to think rage was loud, shouting, slamming doors, broken glass. But the kind that settled into me after that dinner was quiet, like a fire you don't notice until the room is already filled with smoke. The fallout from Casey's exposure spread fast. Within a day, half the family had called me not to apologize but to negotiate. My aunt left me voicemails suggesting we could smooth this over. My uncle sent a text that read, "Family helps family. Don't ruin her future over mistakes." Mistakes. That was the word they used for months of manipulation and deceit. And Casey, she went online. The very next morning, a post appeared on her Instagram. Betrayed by blood. Some people would rather humiliate you than share what was freely given to them. Underneath, a picture of her sitting on the curb, mascara streaked like stage paint. Hashtags, toxic family, trust fund tyrant, pray for him. Thousands of likes rolled in within hours. People who didn't know the story, who never met me, rushed to comfort her. She had turned her downfall into a performance, and the crowd loved it. I stayed quiet. I knew better than to wrestle in her arena. But silence has weight, and soon the whispers reached my office. A colleague asked if everything was all right. A neighbor left a note saying, "Ignore the noise, we see through it." Noise, yes, but constant noise still erodes stone. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was another gathering, this time a holiday dinner at my parents' house. The table sagged under dishes, but the air was thinner than ever. Casey showed up late again, but not empty-handed. She brought a laptop. She waited until dessert when everyone was trapped with coffee cups and half-finished cake. Then she clicked play. A slideshow. Not of her evidence of mine. She had stolen copies of my folder. Screenshots, receipts, emails, all presented with her narration twisted into something unrecognizable. She framed herself as the victim, me as the jealous cousin who hoarded wealth and plotted to destroy her. At the end, she looked at me across the table. "If you really loved family," she said, voice sweet as syrup, "you'd forgive. Isn't that what Grandpa would want?" Something inside me snapped. I didn't shout. I didn't throw a glass. I simply stood and pushed back my chair. "Enough," I said, my voice steady calm. "You want an audience. You've had one. But here's what you don't understand, Casey. This isn't your stage. This isn't your story. And it ends tonight." Her smile faltered. She had expected rage, not resolve. I pulled out my phone and opened a file I had been saving for this exact moment. Videos. The security system from the estate where Casey had used the house for parties she never asked permission for. Footage of her handing my grandfather's tools to strangers in exchange for cash. Proof no caption could spin. I cast it to the television in the corner of the dining room. One by one, the clips played. The silence that followed was heavy. Even the children too young to understand felt it. When it ended, I put my phone down. "This is what family means to her," I said. "Decide for yourselves if that's what you want to protect." No one spoke. Not my aunt, not my uncle, not even my parents. The only sound was the tick of the wall clock marking the moment everything changed. But what they didn't know was that this was only the beginning. I thought the night of the projector would be the end of it. Proof laid bare, words undeniable, a roomful of relatives forced to see what had been right in front of them. But truth has a strange way of stretching. What you think is the bottom often hides another floor beneath it. In the days that followed, the silence was louder than the accusations had ever been. Phone calls dwindled. Group chats went quiet. The cousins who once asked for favors now avoided my messages. Not because they sided with Casey, but because they feared being next. Exposure makes everyone wonder what they've left behind in text or paper. Casey, though, did not retreat. She doubled down. Her social media lit up daily. Teary monologues about betrayal. Posed photographs of her in borrowed cars captioned, "Never let envy steal your joy." It was theater, and she played her role without shame. But for all her noise, the real storm gathered elsewhere. It began with an envelope. A lawyer, our grandfather's lawyer, called me to his office. The kind of place where mahogany desks gleam under lamps too dim for reading, where files sit in rows like tired soldiers. He slid a document toward me without flourish. It was another copy of the will, the full version this time, not the summaries passed around at family dinners. And there it was, in his unmistakable hand, a clause my grandfather had added in the last year of his life. Any descendant proven to have engaged in fraud, theft, or deceit against family shall forfeit all claims to discretionary support. I read it twice. My chest tightened not from shock, but from recognition. He had seen it coming. He had known what greed does when the scent of money is in the air. The clause was his final shield, a way to protect his legacy from becoming a battlefield. "Casey has already violated it," the lawyer said, tapping the page. "Forgery of signatures on loan applications. Unauthorized sales of estate property. We've documented enough." I remembered the missing tools, the parties in the house, the casual way she treated what wasn't hers. She hadn't just insulted me, she had broken the very terms that secured her future. Still, I hesitated. To invoke the clause meant more than family arguments. It meant courtrooms, judgments, headlines in the local paper. It meant the last bridge burning to ash. That night, I sat alone in the estate house. The keys felt heavier in my palm. I walked through each room, the study with its books that smelled of dust and ink, the kitchen where my grandfather once polished apples until they shone, the porch where he smoked a pipe and told me patience outlasts anger. Patience, yes. But patience is not the same as surrender. The next gathering sealed my decision. It was another dinner this time at a cousin's graduation party. The hall was crowded tables lined with casseroles and store-bought cakes. I kept to myself, sipping water, listening more than speaking. And then I heard it Casey laughing near the door, telling a group of friends that I was paranoid, that I had faked the evidence, that I was too dull to spend money wisely anyway. Just wait, she whispered loudly enough for me to hear. The estate will be mine. Lawyers can be persuaded. That was the moment. Not the insult, not the arrogance, but the certainty in her voice that truth could be bent if you pressed hard enough. I smiled then, a small private smile, because what she didn't know was that her certainty had already built the case against her. Over the next week, I gathered everything: the receipts, the videos, the emails, bound into a dossier thick enough to bruise if dropped. I delivered it to the lawyer with steady hands. "This is not revenge," I told him. "This is protection." He nodded. "Your grandfather would call it the same." The legal wheels began to turn. Papers filed, hearings, scheduled notices sent. Casey didn't know yet, not fully, but soon she would. And while the lawyers worked, the internet turned. The same audience that once cheered her posts began to question. Screenshots leaked, whispers spread. People compared her stories to the evidence, and the cracks showed. Followers unfollowed. Brand deals she bragged about quietly dissolved. One evening, scrolling through the noise, I saw a comment beneath her latest post. "Funny how the victim always has the nicest shoes." It had thousands of likes. For the first time, I felt the balance shift. But what no one in the family realized was that the storm hadn't reached its peak. Exposure was one thing, consequences were another. And soon both would arrive. I used to think revenge was about fire, about shouting, breaking, throwing, but when the moment finally came, it was not fire that consumed the room, it was silence. A silence so heavy that even breathing felt like a decision. The court hearing was not glamorous. No chandeliers, no velvet drapes. Just plain walls, rows of wooden benches, and the faint buzz of a light that needed replacing. The kind of place where truth feels stripped of decoration. I sat near the front, the folder of evidence resting on my lap like a stone. Casey arrived late, sunglasses, hiding eyes that once commanded whole rooms. She carried herself like a performer walking on stage, confident in her costume, convinced the applause would come eventually. But applause does not echo in courtrooms. Only facts do. The lawyer read through the will, each word like gravel dropped into a bucket. Any descendant proven to have engaged in fraud, theft, or deceit against family shall forfeit all claims. My grandfather's voice lived in those words, clear, unyielding, waiting for this very day. The evidence followed. Emails where Casey mocked my generosity, screenshots of bank transfers, and her Instagram posts flaunting what she had bought with them. Videos from the estate security cameras showing parties, strangers, walking off with tools and heirlooms. One clip of her signing a document with a shaky imitation of my grandfather's name. Each piece landed like a hammer. Casey tried to laugh it off. "Those messages are jokes," she said. "You can't take private words seriously." Her voice cracked on the word private. She said the videos were edited. She said the posts were out of context. But context doesn't erase, dates doesn't change handwriting, doesn't stop her own voice from echoing in the recordings. At one point, she stood and pointed at me. "You did this," she shouted, her words sharp enough to make the clerk flinch. "You've always been jealous. You want me ruined. Admit it." I did not stand. I did not shout back. I simply looked at the judge and said, "I only brought the truth. The rest is hers." The silence after that lasted longer than her outburst. When the ruling came, it was short. The clause stood. Casey was stripped of any claim to the estate, effective immediately. She gasped, stumbling back into her chair. For the first time, she looked smaller than me, not because I had grown, but because her performance had collapsed under its own weight. The family murmured behind me. Some whispered relief, others anger. My aunt dabbed her eyes, though I wasn't sure if it was for me or for the money that had slipped through her daughter's fingers. My uncle shook his head like it was all some misunderstanding, but none of their whispers mattered anymore. I walked out of the courtroom into the sharp air of the city. The sky was overcast, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight was not gone. It never really goes, but it had shifted. I no longer carried her lies on my shoulders. She carried them herself now. In the days that followed, her world cracked quickly. Friends unfollowed. Sponsors withdrew. The video from the birthday dinner projector receipts her meltdown went viral. Millions watched her call me nothing. Millions watched her rage. Millions watched her break. The comments were brutal. "This is why entitlement ruins families. Imagine biting the hand that feeds you." She really said ATM with feelings. I didn't share it. I didn't need to. The truth had a life of its own now. One night, weeks later, I walked through the estate house again. I stopped in my grandfather's study, touched the worn edges of his favorite book, and sat in his old chair. I thought about patience, about storms, about the way silence had carried me farther than anger ever could. Revenge, I realized, is not always about destruction. Sometimes it is about letting someone's own weight pull them down and choosing not to follow. Casey had wanted the estate. Instead, she became a story told by strangers online, a warning whispered in family kitchens, a lesson carved into the very walls she once claimed as hers. And me, I still had the keys, I still had the folder, but more importantly, I still had my peace. You expect endings to be loud, applause, confessions, a curtain dropping, but the ending of this story was quiet, quieter than I imagined. Casey disappeared from the family gatherings first. At Thanksgiving, her chair sat empty, the fork and knife still neatly placed in case she walked in late, as she always used to. She never did. At Christmas, no one even set her place. By spring, her name was only mentioned in sighs and half sentences that trailed off before anyone finished them. Online, she was louder for a while. She posted long rants about betrayal, about toxic relatives, about how money corrupts love. But the comments grew harsher. People mocked the contradictions in her stories, compared her screenshots to mine, pointed out the receipts that couldn't be faked. Eventually, she stopped posting altogether. Silence swallowed her, the same silence she once tried to bury me under. As for me, life did not become perfect, but it became mine again. I fixed the porch swing at the estate and spent evenings there with a book. I walked the halls and felt my grandfather close, not because of the money he left, but because of the values stitched between each clause in his will. Patience, dignity, responsibility. I did not sell the estate. I did not flaunt it either. Instead, I used part of the inheritance to start a small scholarship fund at the local community college. My grandfather believed in hard work, and I thought it fitting that his name would help students who worked as hard as he once did. Family still looked at me differently, some with respect, some with envy, some with distance. But I no longer carried their expectations on my shoulders. Their opinions were theirs to keep. My peace was mine. One evening, as I sat on that porch swing with the summer air thick and the fireflies blinking across the yard, I thought about what revenge had really meant. It wasn't about making Casey cry. It wasn't about proving myself right. It was about showing the truth, standing firm, and letting the world see what I had endured. Revenge wasn't fire, it was light. And in that light I found closure. But I'll leave you with this. If you think I made the right choice, comment right. If you have a better way, share your idea. Because in families, in money, in betrayal, there are always choices. And sometimes the hardest part isn't what you lose, it's deciding what you're willing to carry forward.